Welcome back. Today we are talking with Ray Holliman about one of his sessions at the DRJ Spring 2023 conference in Orlando this year. Ray, lots of great information in the first segment about cloud testing. Now I'd like to touch base on the second presentation you gave, and that was entitled Translating the Words, Rules, and Regulations of Resilience. Now, if that doesn't grab people's attention, I don't know what does. What were you getting at in this presentation?
So with this presentation, I co-presented this with someone else, and so I've been on DRJ's glossary committee for the last 2 years, and so really what we were doing was reminding people that the glossary exists out here. A lot of people didn't know where it was or didn't know like that DRJ even had this as a resource. So a lot of this was reminding people because especially coming out of COVID and a lot of people have moved into business continuity, disaster recovery, emergency management. We're seeing a lot of new faces that weren't here prior to that because
Mhm.
companies started seeing that, hey, this is really a need that we have with the pandemic, and people have got into it during the pandemic and have enjoyed it. And so now they're trying to get more education behind it. And so we did this session to kind of talk about one half of it was like all the rules and regulations that kind of drive our industry. And then the other half was really to talk about the glossary that we have and how it can be used as a resource where people have been, you know, we may say recovery time objective means one thing, but another organization may something else, or internally in your own organizations, you may have defined it as something. But for those people that have not defined it or want to go to somewhere that's like an industry standard, we're trying to pull all this information together so people know that, hey, we are looking across the industry to say, okay, we're looking at NIST and we're looking at ISO and we're seeing how they're defining these terms. And we're trying to bring all of that together in one area so that people know these are terms like if you don't have a good definition for it in your organization, start here because this is what we're
Mm.
pulling kind of the cream of the crop from the rest of the industry. So you can use these as your terms. And it also allows your senior leadership to know that, okay, you're not just making this definition up. You've gone somewhere and pulled this. And it's actually, we cite wherever we pull the definitions from. So you can go and see, here's all of our information that we're looking at and really just trying to, and the same thing with rules and regulations. It's a source for people to really be able to use and know what are all the different rules and regs that you can use to justify why you need a business continuity program, a disaster recovery program, how some of these may impact your industry as your industry evolves and changes.
I've got a copy of the glossary every couple of years or so. I print out a new version. It's just over here out of reach
Yeah.
because sometimes uh, dealing with different clients, words and phrases and definitions do mean something different. And as you say, I agree. Here's the industry definition of RTO, using your example. What does that mean to you? Does it mean the same? No, it means this. Great, then that's the one we'll follow.
Hmm.
So at least it keeps us all on the same page. But if they didn't have a definition, then it's like, oh, that's the industry. Good, then that's what we'll follow because it's
Hmm.
also a booster.
Hmm.
Oh, we're going to follow the industry definition. Hey, that's good.
Exactly. And it's getting people to realize that, you may have your own terms, but it's a great place to start if you don't have anything, or if people are getting terms confused, because a lot of times that's what I'll see. They're like,
Mm.
oh, I thought RTO meant this, but they'll actually be speaking to RPO. And so I'm like, here, let me explain to you how these are different, or what you're thinking of is actually something else. And so let me show you from an industry standpoint because a lot of times I'm speaking to people who are not in the industry. Like they work tangentially to us, but they may be an infrastructure person. So they have in their mind what a recovery a time objective may be, but that may be different than how I define it. And so it's like it allows kind of like you said for everybody to be on the same page as we're discussing. And so we know that we're having the same conversation and they're not leaving the conversation thinking one thing and I'm leaving it thinking something else, and then we meet back together in a week, we we still aren't on the same page. So it kind of helps for everybody to get onto the same page very early and very quickly by just saying, like, here are the definitions that we're going to use. Here are the terms that you use. Okay, great. I will use that as my guiding force because that's what you're used to. And but I know what these terms mean to you, and that just
Mhm.
helps me.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of us in the industry sometimes forget. We're trying to push our definitions and industry definitions on people when they've already been established somewhere. But it's good for us to know the difference because sometimes we'll go to a third place and know that, hey, they're having challenges and they don't like this industry definition, but I know another one that might help them.
Exactly. And
Now,
so
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, I think that's the thing is that, it allows for you to know, hey, what's the industry, but how are other people using that same term? Because you never know where it may not fit perfectly for that customer, the industry may, but somebody else's definition may be better aligned to kind of how they run their business.
Yeah, agreed. Now, regulations. There are, quite a few, and it seems as time goes by, there's more and more that are coming out around the globe with regards to business continuity or disaster planning or resilience, which is one of those buzzwords really that out there right now for everything. How do you go about establishing what regulation works for you as well? Because they sometimes, I won't say contradict each other, but they do offer different viewpoints. So how do you know what's going to work for you? Because part of one might work and part of another might work for you.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that is really looking at how is your organization set up and structured? Are you somebody that likes to follow NIST standards? Are you somebody that likes to follow the ISO standards? Like if that's how your
Mhm.
organization is structured, taking those at face value and bringing that in because that's what you know your leadership is going to want you to follow, that may be the best way to go about it. I've also seen other organizations that do okay, we're going to kind of look at this has some really great stuff, but we kind of like some of this other stuff that's happening over here. Or sometimes you're just mandated because of, you're a financial institution or you're a healthcare institution and you have other mandates. And so that gives you your requirements. But I think it really depends upon like, what are you getting out of that? What are you getting out of that rule? What are you getting out of that regulation? Like, is it something that you have to follow for your end to be compliant in your industry, or is it just more of a guiding point for you because you want to elevate your program? And I think that's really what kind of helps make the difference is because a lot of times when you're starting out, you may just need a framework to start with. So NIST may be just a place to start because you're just getting started on this journey. And then as you evolve and you see that you're like, well, not all of this stuff applies to us, but everything that does apply to us, we are going to use because it makes sense and it gives us a structure and it gives us a way to validate that we are meeting all of these different checkpoints.
That it's interesting the way you just described that because I'm sure you've probably run into this. I know I have quite a few times. Is audit and compliance will just latch on to a single regulation or a standard or guideline or framework, whatever's out there, and then will point out a whole bunch of things that you're not doing right, but it's because you're not actually following that standard in full. How do you go about trying to align that so like, hey, you need to look at these other things as well. We're not just using that framework.
Yeah, I think that's where, it's has to become a partnership with the audit, with the people doing it and saying that like you are grading us to a standard that we are not even following. Let us show you like here's what we have been going by. Audit us to this and tell us where we're failing, not just something that you randomly pulled out and said, okay, we're going to follow this standard, but we're not going to tell you that you need to follow this standard. Because really that needs to be a conversation and saying, hey, we've been working on trying to do the NIST controls. So can you audit us against these controls? Because that's what we've been working towards for the last year versus trying to do the ISO standards because that may not be what we've been working on, but that's what you've been grading us to. So yes, we're going to fail because that's not what we've been working towards. And so that really leads to having a conversation within internally in the organization and saying that like yes, we want to be audited. Like we're not trying to get away from from being audited. We just want to be audited on the thing that we're actually trying to implement versus something else that we haven't even looked at.
Yeah, I've run into that a few times myself. It's like, what are you talking about? We're not doing that. It's like, oh, well, then you've got a deficiency. Oh, no, I don't. It
Right.
doesn't even apply to us. But it becomes that sometimes tick box mentality when we start talking
Mhm.
about rules, regulations, and standards. It's like, okay, here's all the things, and then off they go on someone's list, and there you go.
Yeah, and I think having that kind of mentality of just trying to check the tick boxes, it doesn't that doesn't always work because it's like organizations are complex and no two organizations are the same. No two departments are even the same. And so you've got to make sure that like, you know, having the framework and the guidelines help, but like everybody's got to be following the same page. Like, audit, we're going to be doing this. Come grade us in 6 months and tell us how we're doing, because that'll show what progress did we make over from where we started, which was nowhere, to 6 months to a year. And so being able to see that also allows you to report up to senior leadership. Hey, in a year's time, we were able to go from, basically having all of these, having no program to having this basically the beginning structure of a program. Now, when we come back to you in a year from now, we should be able to even show you more compliance to all of these things. But that all means that everybody in the organization has to be on board with following this. And so, audit, you can't be grading us to something that we don't know about. You can't, I always say it's like, you can't move the goalpost on me. Cause like, I didn't even
Yeah.
know these goalposts were here. And so that's really that thing of like ensuring that people understand what are you grading them on. And that also goes back to, just that transparency of making sure everybody is speaking the same language, speaking the same rules and regs. Like everybody knows as an organization what we are marching forward with.
And on that, there's another topic I want to ask you about. And we talked about this during our break here. Resilience. Resilience has kind of become a buzzword and almost a catch-all for
Mhm.
everything. So how do you go about dealing with that? Because we have personal or individual resilience, we have operational resilience, we have community resilience. We see the word appear everywhere. I even saw one article a little while ago of a guitar player on stage, had to was fixing something, and they said, "Oh, I don't know, a bum note or something like that in the
Mhm.
song." Said, "Oh, that guitar player is resilient." What? Yeah, like, wait a minute. We're using this word now for everything under the sun. So how do you go about trying to define that part when it comes to rules, regulations, and definitions and all the different ways it is being used?
I feel like resilience has we as a committee we've talked about it a ton because we had resilience, and then you started having cyber resilience and operation resilience and enterprise resilience, and then you have like resiliency in the company, financial resilience. I'm like, we're just putting any word in front of resilient and saying that's what it is. And so a lot of this is coming down to really figuring out like, okay, what do we mean by resilience? Okay, we really are meaning the ability to bounce back, after a conflict or a disruption. Okay, let's start there. So like when we look at a cyber resilience, okay, how can we bounce back from a cyber event? The department I'm in is called enterprise resilience. And so it's like for us, how we've defined that is business continuity, disaster recovery, and cybersecurity. All three of our departments kind of fall under this one umbrella, and we kind of the things that make sense for us to talk about together, we do. But there's obviously things that we do that do not make sense for us to talk about from a resilient standpoint altogether. So a lot of it is, I think, people and organizations are having to find what does resilience mean to them. We've actually had a hard time really coming up with a
Mm,
definition of resilience because it's used in so many different ways. The way I kind of use it is like, what's your ability and capacity to bounce back after a disruption? Really simple. You can use it in any kind of term. Didn't get too into like very specific business continuity disaster recovery because I mean that's what resilience is. And so I think that's how a lot of organizations are using it. I'm seeing a lot of organizations right now, we're seeing them use it from a financial resilience standpoint of with all the layoffs and things that they're doing to make sure that they're going to stay in business. And so it's an interesting term. And so I first started, using resiliency in a different way, where it was kind of looking at does disaster recovery plus high availability equal like resiliency? That's how I started using it in the past because people were saying, oh, we need our systems to be resilient. And I'm like, what do you mean by that? Well, we want them to be
mhm.
always available. I was like, that's great. You can want your system to be always available. But what happens if you have a corruption event and you had two sides and now they're both corrupted? You've lost your resiliency there. You've lost your high availability. So you still have to have your disaster recovery, your backups, things like that there. And so it's getting people to think that resiliency is not just your ability to stay up, and not see a disruption, but how do you recover from that disruption? And I think that kind of definition and terminology really makes it apply to really anything that you could think of like personally, like, okay, you have a hard time. How are you going to bounce back from it? Cyber, operationally, thinking about it in those kind of ways really kind of helps you think through that resilience mindset.
I've had other guests on the show, and they've said that with resilience, there's a set of characteristics associated with it. And you kind of touched on that with what you just said here, that if there are certain things in place, well, then you are resilient. Lessons learned. If you have something that
Hmm.
occurs, if you have all these sessions, lesson learned sessions, well, that's great. But if nothing changes, well, then you aren't contributing to your resilience. You're just going through the motions, really.
Hmm.
So is that another way of looking at it too? Is that there's a set of characteristics that we have in our organization, whether they be technical or administrative or cultural, that if we're addressing them and moving them forward, then when we do experience something, we are contributing to our resiliency.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think it's the whole mindset that you have about it. How are you making sure that all the people on the team know how to do every part of the job? They might not do it every day,
Mhm.
but when it's all hands on deck, they may have to step into a role they're typically not in. When you do your lessons learned, are you just documenting it for posterity, or are you actually making improvements to your system, to your how the operations are done to see that you are making those changes? So I really think it is a set of characteristics where you're really starting to think about like it's like one part is like how do you bounce back, but then what did we learn from that, and how can we make sure that when this happens again, we don't do it the exact same way? How can we make sure that we have a shorter time to recovery? What have we implemented from our lessons learned to say, oh well, last time it took us 2 hours to get everybody on the phone. Well, we implemented an emergency communication tool, and now we can get everybody direct dial and onto the phone in 5. That's a great way where you've been enhancing your resiliency as you've been moving forward and using your lessons learned as a way to enhance your resiliency.
As previous guests I've had on the show, the authors of Bounce Forward, Cynthia Barlow and Jennifer Eggers, said it's not just bouncing back. You got to be able to bounce forward.
Hmm.
You got to be able to move forward. Otherwise, you are in the same spot as you were before, which doesn't better position you for anything.
Yeah, learn from your past to enhance your future.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well said. We're coming to the end of this segment, Ray. Do you have any final thoughts on the session translating the words, rules, and regulations of resilience?
Yeah, I just want people to know that, as a committee at DRJ, we are trying to hear from people. Like if there are terms that are missing that you're using, we need to know because we don't know what everybody's using in the industry. Some of the good conversations that we had in it was also partnering with other resilience organizations like DRJ, like BCI, and starting to figure out like, do we need to come together as a collective and start looking at not only what we use, here, in North America, but what's used worldwide? How do we start making sure that more of these terms are more global in usage and seeing how the definitions may shift and change, especially as a lot of our companies become more global? And so that was one of the really good insights that I got was that some gods are very like EU specific or um, uh, North America specific. How do we make that more global in context so that way
Yeah.
when we come to these conferences, we all know that, we can be speaking the same language, the same terminology, because I think that's really important to continue to just enhance our profession and know that all of these terms out here exist.
I recommended that when I was on a closing panel back in 2016, 17, somewhere around there, with Cheyenne Marling. I don't know if you know Cheyenne.
Hmm.
And I said it would be nice if some of these different organizations could get together and really come to one definition for words to put us all on the same page. And I made that recommendation to some of the BCI, DRI people that were there. You should have seen some of the looks I got. But that's some of the challenge. People want their own silo, and that's part of the problem, I think,
Hmm.
that people don't want to give that up. Instead of coming together as you suggested, they want to stay in their silo.
Yeah, and we had some people from BCI come up to me after my talk and said they're definitely interested because they have the same problem of the information being buried on their site and just trying to get visibility to it. So that's one of the things that I hope is I took back to the committee and was like, hey, we really need to start working on this and maybe
Yeah.
promoting the glossary in a different way so that way people know that it exists and it's out here.
Yeah, and it would be nice if we did speak the same language.
Exactly. I'm
You
like,
know,
that would be so easy if we all just said the same language and we knew what the words meant. It'd
yeah.
make my life half a little bit easier. Say completely, but it'll make it a little bit.
Well, if I went to Spain, I have to learn and know at least some Spanish to be able
Hmm.
to understand what's going on. But
Exactly.
for some reason in our industry, we're kind of not doing that in some
Right.
respects. So, Ray, thank you so much for joining us. We've come to the end of the second segment. I really appreciate you sharing your time here and talking about your presentations at DRJ.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been great.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I know this was your second and or third, second, sorry, time being here. So maybe there'll be a third.
Yeah, maybe.
Thanks once again, Ray, and everybody watching and listening. Stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.